Going to talk about Hemingway and his relationship to modernism. So make sure you have paper and pencil out, you take notes, you pause the video when you need to, and come back to it later. So love him or hate him, Ernest Hemingway is one of the most important American writers that we have in the American canon. His influence on the writers who followed him, well, on his contemporaries, but also on the writers who followed him, was just absolutely enormous. And he also had an influence on writers around the world. He was experimental and prolific. At the time of his death, he was the most famous writer in the entire world. And from the publication of his earliest novel until his death, there wasn't really a period of time when his work wasn't well regarded and popular, not just among literary critics, but among the general population. So unlike Faulkner or some of the other modernists who were maybe well known within literary circles, but not so well known among the general public, Hemingway was popular in both cases. So we're going to talk a little bit today about his aesthetics and his impact on American modernism. And we'll start with his background because it's kind of important to understand the influences from that background and how they formed his aesthetics. So Hemingway was born, like so many of our modernist writers, at the close of the 19th century, 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois. Like Fitzgerald, he was a Midwesterner. Like Faulkner, he was from a small town. So again, we're seeing that kind of repeated pattern of modernist writers who came from very kind of insulated places that at the turn of the 20th century, those places are starting to open up to the wider world, especially through World War I. So in 1917, he got a job with the Kansas City Star as a reporter, and he also went to war, not as a soldier because he had some sort of an eye issue that kept him out, but as an ambulance driver. He was injured less than a month into his time serving in World War I, and he was injured with like a tremendous amount of shrapnel that kind of tore up his leg and parts of his body, and that shrapnel, some of it stayed with him until his death. So he was also seen as a hero because of this injury, because even though he was injured, he carried a fellow soldier to safety. He spent some time in France recuperating. This is the basis for A Farewell to Arms, the story of a young soldier who falls in love with an older nurse. That did in fact happen. He did have kind of a love affair with an older nurse that didn't work out in the long run. But when he gets back to America and he's back being a reporter again, reentry to civilian life was really difficult after all he'd been through. There was a sense of being apart from American society and alienation, and there was a real estrangement from his family, especially from his mother, who he was close to before. So in 1921, he marries Hadley Richardson, who is the daughter of a wealthy businessman. And together they go to live in Paris with that larger expatriate community we've mentioned before. In part, he's living off of Hadley's money. In part, he's living off the money he's making writing short stories, mostly Hadley's money. And in part, just because Paris was so very, very inexpensive for Americans. The exchange rate was just ridiculously good. So you could live like a king on not very much money at all. And this really allowed many writers of the time to make a living and try to be a writer or an artist for their living instead of going to work, in an office or a building. So when he is in Paris, he's part of this larger community of expatriates, which are basically the who's who of modernism. He becomes good friends with Gertrude Stein and her partner Alice B. Toklas. He's friends with Ezra Pound. He makes friends with Sylvia Beach, who owns Shakespeare and Company, which is a really famous bookstore where basically all of the expatriates from all the different countries come. He makes friends with Ford Madox Ford and James Joyce. James Joyce is there from Ireland. So the expatriate community is very, very international. It's not just a bunch of Americans sitting in Paris. You have Americans and British and people from around Europe. While he is in Paris, he is pretty prolific as a writer. In 1925, In Our Time is published in America, and it's a collection of short stories and vignettes, really short little snippets of kind of stories that are almost poetic, that form a larger narrative, and that includes Indian Camp, which is one of our readings for this week. It also includes the beginning of the Nick Adams stories, and the Nick Adams stories are one of Hemingway's kind of more famous short story collections. In the Nick Adams stories, and especially in Our Time, we see the beginning of one of his most important themes, which is that traditional masculine assurance and authority, it can't hold in this new world, right? Modernity is going to kind of smash traditional masculinity to bits. And men and women as well are going to have to figure out how to pick up those pieces and redefine themselves. So he publishes In Our Time in 1925, and despite it being a pretty small circulation run, it gets really, really good critical acclaim. He publishes one other short kind of satire called The Torrents of the Spring in between, but it's basically just to get out of a publishing contract. And then in 1926, he publishes The Sun Also Rises with Scribner Publishing, which is one of the largest and most prestigious publishing companies at the time. And it is, from the very beginning, a runaway hit. It tells the story of Jake Barnes, who is an American veteran from World War I who has been injured from the war. He has this unnamed injury that makes it impossible for him to perform sexually. He's in love with Lady Brett Ashley, and though she loves him, the whole story is just kind of about how they're never going to be able to be together. This is a story that's all about fishing. It's about bullfighting. They go to Spain. He does the running with the bulls. And it really establishes a lot of the themes that Hemingway is going to be preoccupied with throughout his writing career. So one of the things that's most important about Hemingway is not just his popularity, but what he does for aesthetics. In Our Time is our first glimpse of this, but throughout his entire career, he uses a really sparse, clear prose. So if we think back to romantics or naturalists that are using a lot of like imagery to kind of bring beauty and lyricism into writing, if we think about realism in the later half of the 19th century that's using lists and lists and lists of items, right? Describing minute details of every book and every candlestick in a room. Hemingway wipes all that away. His sentences tend to be very, very short, clipped almost, and he really focuses on the elimination of unnecessary details. This means his books tend to be a lot shorter, and at first they will seem to be easier to read, but oftentimes people approaching Hemingway get really frustrated by the kind of sparseness of his prose because he doesn't give you a lot. So we're going to talk a little bit about why he uses this prose style and why it's important to understanding his position within modernism, and especially within American modernism. So he talks about his time in Paris, and this quote is from his memoir, A Movable Feast, about that time. And the thing about being in Paris with his expatriates is it's not just writers and poets who are there. It's artists, it's dancers, it's musicians, it's a lot of the really famous artistic creators of the early 20th century. So he talks about learning from these artists. He says, I was learning something from the paintings of Cézanne that made writing simple, true sentences far from enough to make stories have the dimensions that I was trying to put into them. I was learning very much from him, but I was not articulate enough to explain it to anyone. Besides, it was a secret. So he's very self-consciously trying to find a new way to write. This goes back to our idea of a modernist aesthetic with make it new. He's friends with Picasso at this time. He's really interested and influenced in Cubism, especially with this idea that you can have this image of hard, clear lines and this kind of fractured representation, and yet the truth of what it's showing is still there. Like from this image, you can kind of see it's a guitar. Your initial impulse is probably to see some sort of a stringed instrument in this picture, even though the picture itself doesn't clearly depict a realistic guitar. And Hemingway is really interested in how these visual artists are changing the way we perceive, right? And this is part of what's going to go into his ideas about style. In Paris, in this early part of his writing, he comes up with the theory of omission. He says, it was a very simple story called Out of Season, and I had omitted the real end of it, which is that the old man hanged himself. This was omitted on my new theory that you could omit anything if you knew that you omitted, and the omitted part would strengthen the story and make people feel something more than they understood. Oftentimes, the theory of omission is referred to as the iceberg principle. He says in Death in the Afternoon, which is one of his writings about bullfighting, but also about art, he says, if a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit the things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of the movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. And so when we think about this iceberg theory, it comes from some of his background. First of all, it comes from his days as a reporter when he was forced to focus on just the events themselves without all the extraneous detail or commentary. It's a minimalistic style that focuses on the events and doesn't address the themes below. And he had this theory that the deeper of a meaning of a story should not necessarily be evident on the surface. It wasn't the writer's job to tell the reader what they should be feeling, but if it was written truly enough, and that's really the key in Hemingway's aesthetic theories, is it has to be true. The writer has to be brave and courageous and really know what they're doing and write something true. If that happens, then the truth will shine through. And anyone who's ever seen pictures of an iceberg sees that the majority of it lies below the waterline. Certainly this wasn't good for the Titanic when the iceberg wasn't seen because so much of it lied below the waterline. So a lot of what we're seeing in Hemingway's work is his attempt to give us only the hard, true facts so that it creates a feeling and that the reader is really pulled in aesthetically. He has some goals in his style, including how to get the most from the least. Henry James famously quoted that World War I had used up all the words, right? So after World War I, what was left to say? Hemingway takes this very truly, and it's this idea that you can prune language to avoid waste. And by doing that, you really achieve multiple intensities and you can tell a truth beyond the truth on the page. So you can tell someone that they should be sad about a scene, or you can create a scene that is so true to life that the reader will implicitly and instinctively feel the sadness and the truth of that sadness. It really puts a lot on the reader so that even though his work tends to be short and very quick reads, if the reader is not paying attention and not engaged, they're going to miss most of it. He talks about his theory of omission, saying, if I started to write elaborately or like someone introducing or presenting something, I found that I could cut that scroll work or ornament out and throw it away and start with the first true, simple, declarative sentence I had written. He said, you could omit anything if you knew that you omitted, and the omitted part would strengthen the story and make people feel something more than they understood. He also talks about truth. He says, all you have to do is write one true sentence in A Movable Feast. Write the truest sentence that you know. So finally, I would write one true sentence and then go on from there. It was easy then because there was always one true sentence that I knew or I had seen or I had heard someone say. And even in this little clip from A Movable Feast, we see his style. We see that it says it was easy because there was always one true sentence, or I had seen or heard someone say. So there's that kind of multiplication of short declarative points without the usual required punctuation. And that creates a sense of intensity and also replication and repetition. So be careful with Hemingway because the simplicity of his work is really deceptive. You can read Hemingway pretty quickly and not understand any of it because so much of it really requires the reader to think about what's not being said. When we read, a lot of his stories create kind of a multifocal photographic reality. So if you think about a photograph as being just one kind of click, one image of a larger reality, that's kind of what his writing is doing, but the photograph is just a depiction, right? The reality is something else. He uses syntax that creates static sentences. There's very few subordinating conjunctions, which creates a collage of images. So again, going back to that idea of modernist art as kind of being this fragmented, overlayered collage-like aesthetic when we're trying to kind of layer things and multiply in order to get to the truth. Internal punctuation is often omitted, which can sometimes make his sentences trip you up because you're used to having commas and semicolons. But the short declarative sentences usually build on one another and they create a new whole through the experience of the work. He often uses cinematic techniques. So again, he's kind of relying on those modern inventions and modern technologies that are interrupting life during modernity. So something like the jump cut, where a scene suddenly flashes to something else without transitions, he's doing that in his writing as well. He uses the use of and instead of commas to build intensity. And he also uses images as objective correlatives. So an objective correlative is a thing or a series of things that represents an emotion. So we're talking about symbolism here, where the emotion isn't stated or even described, but instead an object or an image is placed in place of it. But the goal in Hemingway's work wasn't to strip emotion. He gets this kind of bad rap as being the man's man writer with this virile masculine prose. But especially when he's starting out as a very young man in 1920s, he's kind of a romantic at heart. He is very sensitive, and he's not interested in stripping out emotion. Instead, he wants to approach emotion more scientifically. He doesn't want the story to tell you how to feel. He wants the story to make you feel. So there are some major themes in Hemingway's work you should be aware of, including love, war, travel, wilderness, and loss. And a lot of those are reflective of his own life experiences. Some of the major themes include death. It's a really, really important theme in Hemingway. He famously said in one of his works, "When you're dead, you are dead." So if we take away the idea of salvation in the next life, if all we have is the moment in front of us, that changes how we orient ourselves to it and how his characters orient themselves to the idea of death and the idea of life in turn. Literary critic Young believes, quote, "Indian Camp holds the master key to what its author was up to for some 35 years of his writing career. The death we experience in Indian Camp is kind of emblematic of how he treats death throughout his work. This idea of what the experience or witness of death can do to a character. In his work, there's the idea that if nothingness is embraced, then redemption is achieved at the moment of death, so that you can't approach life through fear, but through the kind of acceptance of what's to come. And he talks about the bullfighters a lot. He says the bullfighter in the corrida or the arena represents the pinnacle of a life lived with authenticity. A bullfighter faces death when he steps into the arena, and all of his heroes face death as well. He also has a lot of themes involving gender, especially the dark or light woman. Hemingway has for a long time been seen as kind of a masculine writer and sometimes even a misogynist writer. But in actuality, what he does is he represents women in ways that are much more complex than traditional literature. He often inverts the traditional literary archetypes. That angel of the house that we saw in the yellow wallpaper or in The Awakening, that isn't the pinnacle of womanhood anymore. He has the dark woman like Brett Ashley, who maybe is a little bit loose in her sexual mores. That dark woman becomes a goddess, and the light woman often is a murderess, either literally or just kind of metaphorically. That this idea of purity and repression, and that echoes back to Freudian ideas about repression and how it affects and creates trauma in people. That idea of like feminine purity becomes a real way of killing the soul. Another really major theme that we can't forget about is masculinity or emasculation. And that theme comes through a lot of times in what is widely recognized as the Hemingway code hero. So at first, the code hero or the Hemingway hero was seen as this kind of like man's man who hunted and caroused and went to bullfights and slept his way through the world, right? But if we really look at Hemingway's overall body of work, the code hero is much more complex. He is a man's man on the surface many times, but often these are very complex characters that reveal a real disillusionment with life, especially life post-World War I and later life post-World War II. The Hemingway code hero is a sensitive man that's looking for new ways to exist in the post-war world. And really the hallmark of the Hemingway code hero is grace under pressure, courage above all. So for Hemingway, thinking about themes of masculinity and emasculation, honor, courage, and endurance, despite a life filled with pain and tension, are the real values. So you can have a book like The Sun Also Rises, where Jake Barnes is emasculated very literally. Like he has an injury to his private area. We don't even know the extent of the injury, but we know it's bad enough that he cannot have a sexual relationship. It is literal emasculation. And yet, because Jake is courageous, sensitive, and true to himself throughout that book, he becomes a kind of his heroic figure. So that it's kind of turning traditional forms of masculinity and sureness on their head. So that is kind of a brief overview of some of the things you should be looking for as you read through the 2 Hemingway short stories that we have for this